January 1943 opened with a silence that felt unnatural. A calm stretched across the North Atlantic that hid the simple truth that the Allies were losing the war at sea. Newspapers spoke of distant fronts and heroic advances, but few civilians understood the arithmetic that haunted every naval briefing. Ships were vanishing faster than shipyards could replace them. Each week ended with another tally of hulls torn open, cargo swallowed, and lives erased in waters too deep for recovery. The convoys that threaded between America and Britain moved like slow steel caravans, their decks stacked with grain, fuel, ore, and the intangible hope of two nations. Yet convoy after convoy bled tonnage at a rate that cracked even Washington's confidence. 10 fresh Liberty ships could be launched, only for 12 to be lost in the span of a stormy night. It was a war of production measured against a war of precision, and production was faltering. Beneath those waves, Admiral Donitz's wolf packs patrolled the mid-Atlantic gap with patient certainty. The region was a blind spot beyond the reach of Allied aircraft, a stretch of ocean where U-boats surfaced openly, recharged batteries, and coordinated attacks. In that darkness, the submarines were untouchable, unseen, and, most dangerously, unopposed. A single torpedo carried the weight of strategy inside its steel casing. When it struck, 10,000 tons of wheat meant for British bread disappeared in a rising column of spray. 10,000 tons of fuel bound for the Eighth Army sank without trace. 10,000 tons of steel destined for new ships ruptured and rusted on the seabed. Each explosion reshaped the logistics of a global conflict. Destroyers and corvettes raced toward faint sonar echoes, their crews gripping cold railings as they chased shadows that dissolved into the static of the sea. The men heard only fragments, whispers of propellers, the fading pulse of a contact lost to depth. It was a pursuit conducted by sound, hope, and exhaustion. In London, intelligence officers warned that if the mid-Atlantic remained uncovered, the lifeline to Britain might soon break entirely. And yet, among the proposals scattered across Admiralty desks, one idea still rested under a thin film of dismissal, an idea the Navy had once greeted with a laugh. But the ocean was changing, and the weapon they mocked was about to become the only path forward. For the men who sailed the merchant lanes, the worst nights came without warning. The sky offered no moon, only a low ceiling of cloud that merged sea and horizon into a single black sheet. In that darkness, the first sign of danger was rarely the silhouette of a submarine, but the sudden bloom of fire rising from a ship already struck. Survivors spoke of steel twisting as if alive, of bulkheads tearing open with a sound that drowned out every human voice. They remembered the brief glow of burning oil and the colder silence that followed when the light vanished. Convoy commanders watched these scenes with a helplessness that no training had prepared them for. In the dim control rooms of lead escorts, radar screens pulsed with distant returns, small, uncertain blips marking contacts far beyond reach. The enemy was there, scattered across the vastness, yet separated by distances that no ship could close in time. Each echo carried the same message. The attackers chose the battlefield, and the convoys merely endured it. The escort groups stretched themselves thin across routes measured in thousands of miles. A handful of destroyers and corvettes attempted to guard dozens of freighters, each carrying enough material to sustain a regiment or feed a city. Their commanders understood the mathematics of their disadvantage. Every vessel they protected lengthened the line. Every additional mile diluted their strength. The ocean, indifferent and immense, favored the hunter. From Iceland and Newfoundland, Allied aircraft traced long arcs over the water, engines straining against the cold. But their range fell short of the very place protection mattered most. Long before reaching the convoy's vulnerable center, fuel gauges forced them home. The crews turned back, knowing they were leaving an empty sky behind them. An opening the U-boats timed their movements to exploit. By early 1943, reports reaching Washington confirmed the scale of the crisis. 108 operational U-boats roamed the Atlantic, a number sufficient to paralyze the flow of war itself. Each new telegram sharpened the same question whispered in naval corridors and war rooms alike. What weapon could close a 1,000-mile gap? The answer, still untested and underestimated, waited quietly in a corner of the Allied arsenal. The idea arrived quietly, carried not by rank or reputation, but by a handful of officers who understood that the Atlantic was slipping beyond control. Their proposal was radical in its simplicity. Convert ordinary merchant hulls into miniature aircraft carriers, small, slow platforms that could host a few patrol planes. They called them escort carriers. Others used less generous names. To many in the Navy, the thought of turning cargo ships into flattops bordered on the absurd. These vessels, the planners admitted, would be vulnerable. With a top speed barely above 15 knots, they could not outrun submarines or storms. Their decks would be short, their armor thin, their guns few. And yet, each would carry something the convoys desperately lacked: eyes in the sky. A handful of aircraft, nothing more than Wildcats or Avengers, could search far beyond the horizon, spot a periscope's glint, or drive a U-boat under long before it approached the shipping lanes. Senior admirals gathered around the concept, with skepticism sharpened by years of tradition. The Navy had spent decades perfecting the art of carrier warfare, building sleek, fast superstructures meant to project power across oceans. To them, these stripped-down vessels were an insult to the lineage of Lexington and Enterprise. They called the plan impractical, wasteful, even reckless. One admiral dismissed it outright as a floating coffin, a ship that would die before it ever fought. But the designers answered with numbers, not rhetoric. They pointed to studies showing that a single patrol aircraft, circling above a convoy, could compel a U-boat to dive for hours. Submerged, the submarine moved slowly and blindly, forced to conserve battery power and cut radio contact with its pack. The statistics were blunt. Aircraft did not need to sink U-boats to win the battle. They only needed to disrupt the attack. Thus, a quiet argument grew into a clash between tradition and necessity. Washington became a forum of competing instincts, pride on one side, survival on the other. Were these small carriers an embarrassment to naval engineering, or the lifeline that could save the Atlantic route? Each week brought new losses, new convoys struck in the darkness, new telegrams urging action. In the end, the proposal endured not because admirals believed in it, but because they had run out of alternatives. It was chosen the way lifeboats are chosen in a storm, not admired, but needed. And while approval moved forward on paper, another question rose in the background. If these ships were to exist, who would dare command the first of them? Before the war, the U.S. Navy's identity rested on a simple creed: speed, armor, and the reach of a long flight deck. The service had grown from a battleship force into a carrier navy almost reluctantly, carrying forward the traditions of surface warfare even as aviation reshaped its future. By 1941, the fleet carrier had become the new symbol of naval power, sleek, fast, and bristling with aircraft. Everything outside that lineage seemed temporary, a compromise rather than a strategy. To the pre-war planners, naval aviation mattered only when it came from big decks. Escort carriers, with their stubby silhouettes and merchant engines, did not fit the image of a decisive weapon. The doctrine that guided the Navy saw them as auxiliaries at best, slow shadows, trailing behind real combatants. Fleet carriers like Yorktown and Saratoga embodied the Navy's sense of purpose. They could strike thousands of miles from shore, command vast stretches of water, and shift the balance of a campaign with a single air group. By comparison, the small escort carrier appeared almost out of place, an experiment without ambition. In Washington, bureau chiefs insisted that the Atlantic crisis required more destroyers, not carriers. Destroyers had proven their worth in World War I, hunting submarines with depth charges and aggressive maneuver. They were fast, reliable, and already integrated into convoy defense doctrine. To many officers, the idea that aircraft, not hulls, might hold the key to the mid-Atlantic was still unproven. They believed submarines could be beaten with tools already in hand, if only more were built. Admirals voiced another concern in closed-door meetings. Resources, steel, crews, and shipyard hours were finite. Every escort carrier launched meant one fewer destroyer afloat or one fewer component delivered to a fleet carrier under construction. In their eyes, these baby flattops threatened to dilute the Navy's core mission, winning decisive battles in the Pacific. The Atlantic struggle, though costly, seemed a logistical problem rather than an existential one. Submarines were viewed as irritants, not the architects of a strategic collapse. Yet the numbers arriving from the convoy lanes told a different story. The tempo of sinkings rose month after month. Cable after cable from London outlined shortages that could not be solved with reassurances. A war fought on two oceans demanded flexibility, but the Navy's hierarchy still viewed innovation through the lens of battleship-era thinking. Commanders trained to measure sea power in inches of armor and knots of speed struggled to accept that a lightly armed merchant conversion might wield more influence over the Atlantic than a cruiser division. The beliefs that had shaped the Navy for decades were now becoming its blinders. Leaders clung to familiar tools even as the ocean reshaped the rules beneath them. Each lost convoy exposed the gap between doctrine and reality, and every report of a sunken freighter tightened the pressure on those who insisted nothing fundamental needed to change. But in the shipyards where the first escort carriers took shape, a new vision of naval warfare was already emerging, quietly and against the instincts of nearly everyone who wore an admiral's star. In the early months of 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz studied the Atlantic charts with a quiet conviction. The data seemed to confirm what he had argued for years. Allied countermeasures had reached their limit. The convoy system slowed the tempo of losses, but it did not change the direction of the war beneath the waves. The Wolfpack still found their targets. Their torpedoes still struck with lethal precision, and for the moment, the ocean remained a domain the U-boat arm understood more intimately than any opponent. A sense of momentum spread through the submarines themselves. Crews returning to bases in occupied France recorded tonnage figures with a pride that bordered on celebration. They spoke of merchant ships burning against the night horizon, of panicked signals heard over intercepted radios, of captains who maneuvered with confidence sharpened by dozens of patrols. In their mess halls and cramped quarters, the mood was buoyant. Early 1943 had delivered them some of the highest sinking rates of the war. Every successful patrol reinforced the belief that their campaign was entering its decisive phase. Inside German naval intelligence offices, analysts pushed these conclusions further. They projected a breaking point approaching Britain, a mathematical threshold where import losses would outrun even the vast scale of American industrial support. If grain, steel, and fuel could be reduced just a little more, they argued, Britain's wartime economy would buckle. Shipyards would slow. Armies would starve for equipment. The bridge across the Atlantic, already fragile, might collapse entirely, and the U-boats, not the battleships or armies, would be the force that delivered that blow. Part of this confidence sprang from geography itself. The Kriegsmarine believed the Allies simply lacked the means to project meaningful air power into the mid-Atlantic gap. Aircraft from Greenland, Iceland, and Newfoundland could only skim its edges before fuel forced them home. Long-range patrol bombers were few, their numbers stretched across multiple fronts. The result was an empty corridor, an opening the U-boats treated almost as sanctuary. To the Germans, it confirmed a strategic axiom. The ocean's vastness protected them more reliably than steel. Reinforcements further strengthened this optimism. New submarine pens of reinforced concrete rose along the French coast, immune to Allied bombs. Improved torpedoes, with magnetic detonators refined after early war failures, promised greater effectiveness in future patrols. The next generation of U-boats, including designs intended to remain submerged for days, seemed to hint at dominance stretching far into the future. Each technological improvement fed the sense that the Atlantic was a battlefield, permanently tilted in their favor. Among the senior officers of the Kriegsmarine, this belief hardened into something close to inevitability. Admirals spoke of 1943 as the year in which the U-boat fleet would finally strangle Britain's supply lines. They saw no credible Allied innovation on the horizon, no weapon capable of altering the geometry of their advantage. The ocean, in their view, belonged to them. But confidence can be its own form of blindness, for even as they celebrated, shipyards across the Atlantic were launching vessels the Germans had not anticipated, slow, unremarkable silhouettes that concealed a capability the U-boats had never faced, and soon those unassuming ships would step quietly into the mid-Atlantic, carrying with them the one thing the wolf packs could not outmaneuver. The first escort carrier hulls entered the shipyards without ceremony, their arrival marked more by paperwork than enthusiasm. They came as merchant vessels, broad, slow, and built for cargo rather than combat. Yet the war had rewritten their purpose. Welders, machinists, and carpenters studied the blueprints with a mixture of curiosity and doubt. Orders had been signed, steel had been allocated, and the conversions would proceed, even if few believed these ships belonged in a navy at war. The transformation began with the sound of cutting torches peeling back the original superstructures. In their place, workers assembled crude flight decks, long, flat planks reinforced by trusses that creaked in the morning frost. They were nothing like the engineered precision of a fleet carrier's deck. These were makeshift platforms, grafted onto merchant hulls, whose proportions fought the very idea of aviation. To an untrained eye, they looked improvised. To a trained one, they looked improbable. Engineers confronted problems that textbooks had never addressed. The broad hulls produced a slow, heavy roll, threatening to throw aircraft off balance before they ever left the deck. The hangars carved into the cargo spaces were cramped and dim, barely able to house a handful of planes. Weight distribution had to be recalculated with each new brace of steel. The ships behaved unpredictably during sea trials, pitching, flexing, and reminding everyone that they had not been designed for flight. Solving one problem often revealed two more. Naval officers who visited the shipyards returned with reservations they rarely hid. Some watched test landings and shook their heads, calling the flight decks a gamble every time. The margin of error was razor thin. A pilot landing in rough seas had only seconds to align, commit, and hope the arresting gear would catch. Catapult launches were impossible. Takeoffs relied on wind, luck, and engine thrust. The ships asked much from their crews, and even more from their aviators. New pilots assigned to these vessels received the news with mixed reactions. Many had trained for the sleek carriers of the Pacific, ships that symbolized power, not compromise. Being posted to an escort carrier felt like a detour, or worse, a dismissal. They boarded uncertainly, studying the tiny decks and wondering if these ships would prove more dangerous to their own crews than to the enemy. Rumors spread quickly through bases and barracks. A single torpedo, men whispered, would finish her. The hulls were thin, the bulkheads light, and the engines slow. A submarine, given the smallest opportunity, could send the entire structure to the bottom in minutes. Escort carriers seemed to embody every vulnerability a ship could possess. Yet the work continued. Day after day, welders lit their torches, engineers submitted new calculations, and pilots rehearsed the landings that would soon define them. The arithmetic of the Atlantic, of ships sunk, supplies lost, and convoys shattered, left no room for hesitation. Every month of delay cost thousands of tons and thousands of lives. And so, the unwanted ships inched toward completion, not out of confidence, but because the ocean had made the decision for them. Ahead of them waited the test no blueprint could predict, their first encounter with a wolf pack that believed the Atlantic still belonged to Germany. Life aboard an escort carrier forced every crewman, from pilot to deckhand, to relearn the fundamentals of naval aviation. These ships did not behave like the big carriers that filled recruitment posters and training films. Their decks were shorter, their hulls more prone to wandering with the sea, and their engines too slow to generate the steady headwinds pilots relied upon. To fly from an escort carrier was to embrace uncertainty. And so, day by day, the crews built a new discipline, one born not from doctrine, but from necessity. The first challenge came with landing. Fleet carrier aviators had trained on long decks that offered breathing room, margin, and predictability. Escort carriers offered none of that. Pilots approaching the ship watched the bow rise and fall with unsettling rhythm, the entire deck swaying as if hinged at its center. Wind shear struck without warning, slipping beneath wings or shoving aircraft sideways in the final seconds of descent. To counter it, pilots developed their own techniques, shallower approaches, tighter throttle control, and a willingness to wave off at the slightest hesitation. Each landing became a controlled gamble, a blend of skill and patience, sharpened through repetition. Takeoff brought its own challenges. Without catapults, escorts relied on the wind and the ship's modest speed. On calm days, engines strained at full power, while pilots measured every foot of deck ahead of them. The aircraft rolled forward, wheels bouncing against the seams of the planking, knowing that once the prow dipped into a swell, the nose would either lift or not. Pilots learned to listen closely to their engines, to feel the moment a plane crossed the thin line between flight and failure. It was a lesson taught not in lecture halls, but through hours of practice carved from unforgiving conditions. Below the aircraft, deck crews worked in spaces never intended for aviation. The hangars were low and narrow, forcing mechanics to develop new methods of refueling and rearming. Cart paths were improvised. Ammunition had to be passed hand to hand. Fuel hoses were rigged with pulleys to clear overhead beams. In the tight quarters, every task had to be completed faster than on a fleet carrier, yet with greater caution, knowing a single spark or misstep could compromise the entire ship. These routines, refined through trial and error, soon became second nature, an unspoken choreography performed under the hum of engines above. Communication also evolved. Escort carriers operated not as independent strike units, but as guardians of convoys stretched across miles of open sea. Their aircraft needed to coordinate with dozens of merchant ships, each with limited radios and inexperienced crews. New protocols emerged, simplified contact reports, coded bearings, and standardized warnings to guide escorts towards suspected submarines. Pilots learned to describe sightings with brevity, knowing clarity could save minutes, and minutes could save ships. Swordfish and Avenger crews trained relentlessly for anti-submarine patrols, flying low and slow over gray water that hid enemy wakes. Escort carriers lacked the speed to chase U-boats, so their aircraft became the hunters. They practiced techniques unique to their environment, tight search patterns flown close to the deck, depth charge drops coordinated with sonar-equipped escorts, and shadowing maneuvers designed to keep a submarine submerged until destroyers could arrive. Each tactic was refined at sea, shaped by the constraints of a ship that asked them to fight differently. But progress carried a cost. Mistakes were inevitable in a setting where margins were thin. Hard landings snapped undercarriages. Waves caught wingtips and dragged aircraft into the sea. Arresting wires parted under stress, sending planes skidding dangerously close to the bow. Each accident left its mark, on the decks, on the crews, and on the resolve of the pilots who strapped themselves back into their aircraft the next morning. They learned quickly because they had to. There was no alternative. In time, innovation emerged, not from theory or high command, but from survival. The men who served on these ships reshaped naval aviation with each hour flown and each challenge mastered. They forged a new style of warfare, one that embraced the limitations of their vessels and turned them into strengths. And soon, their hard-won skills would meet the test the Atlantic had been preparing since the first convoy set sail, the moment when a single escort carrier faced a wolf pack intent on tearing a convoy apart. When the first escort carrier joined an outbound convoy, the change was felt before the ship had even cleared the harbor wall. Merchant captains, long accustomed to crossing the Atlantic with little more than their own luck, watched the small flattop ease into formation with a mixture of relief and disbelief. It was not a large ship. It lacked the intimidating presence of destroyers or cruisers, yet its flight deck, narrow and weathered, represented something no convoy had ever possessed, an unbroken line of sight into the sky. For the first time, the men hauling grain, fuel, and steel across the ocean felt the faint shift of power, a sense that they were no longer prey traveling through a silent wilderness. At dawn, the new ship proved its worth. Engines coughed to life in the cold morning air as aircraft were pushed into position, wings unfolding like the opening pages of a long-delayed chapter. Pilots lifted off, silhouettes rising against a horizon still touched by night. From above they could see miles of ocean the escorts could never reach. Dark swells, faint wakes, and the subtle distortions that marked a periscope's path. Even the simplest reconnaissance flight transformed the convoy. What had been a vulnerable column of ships now stretched beneath a protective canopy of circling aircraft. Below the waves, the effect was immediate. U-boats, once comfortable stalking convoys at the surface, were forced into premature dives the moment a shadow passed overhead. Batteries drained, air grew stale. Torpedoes that required precise positioning could no longer be set up with patience. Captains shifted from hunters to fugitives, compelled to wait for darkness or bad weather. Each hour submerged chipped away at their initiative. Even without dropping a single depth charge, the escort carrier was reshaping the pace of the campaign. As the patrols continued, intelligence officers ashore recognized the opportunity. Ultra-intercepts, German radio messages decrypted after long nights of analysis, were now guiding flight patterns. Pilots were dispatched to suspected assembly points, tracing the outlines of wolf packs long before they made contact with the convoy. The ocean, once vast and unknowable, shrank into a battlefield the Allies could map with growing accuracy. The escort carriers became not just defensive tools, but moving intelligence platforms linking codebreakers, escorts, and aircraft into a single coordinated net. In the ready rooms, pilots shared what they learned after each mission. They compared notes on submarine movement, the spacing of wolf packs, and the telltale wakes left when a submerged boat edged too close to the surface. These exchanges, quiet and analytical, became the foundation of a new doctrine. Convoys began to maneuver not simply to avoid attack, but to confront it, shifting formation in ways designed to compress U-boat approach angles, concentrating air and escort coverage where it mattered most. What had once been a defensive column evolved into a flexible hunting group. Success did not depend on sinking submarines. In fact, most patrols ended without a confirmed kill. The value lay elsewhere. Every time a pilot's shadow crossed the water, every time a U-boat captain ordered a crash dive at the site of an aircraft, hours of potential ambush were erased. U-boats that could not remain on the surface could not coordinate. They could not transmit. They could not attack. The escort carrier imposed a kind of enforced silence across the mid-Atlantic, denying the wolf packs the very conditions on which their operations depended. A new equation gradually emerged, whispered first among analysts and eventually accepted by commanders. A single escort carrier, small, slow, dismissed by many, could suppress the operations of dozens of submarines simply by being present. Its aircraft turned the sea into a contested space, stripping away the invisibility the U-boats had relied upon since the war began. It was a change no admiral had predicted and no German commander had imagined. And as the next convoy prepared to sail with not one, but several baby Flattops, the Atlantic itself was beginning to tilt, quietly, steadily, in a direction the wolf packs had never accounted for. As the first escort carriers proved their worth at sea, designers returned to their drafting tables with a clearer sense of what these ships needed to survive. The earliest conversions had been hurried improvisations, functional but fragile. Now, each new hull became an opportunity to refine what had once been dismissed as a stopgap. Arresting wires were strengthened and repositioned, their tension calibrated to suit the slower approach speeds of patrol aircraft. Catapult systems, initially thought unnecessary for such small planes, were added in modified form on later carriers, giving pilots a fighting chance during calm seas when natural wind was scarce. Deep within the ships, engineers revised stabilizers and ballast layouts to reduce the aggressive role that had plagued early operations. Slowly, the escort carrier began to shed its reputation as a crude experiment and take shape as a purpose-built tool of war. Above the technical improvements, another revolution was unfolding in the radar rooms. Operators, many still in their early 20s, learned to coax meaning from faint, irregular traces on their screens. U-boats presented almost no silhouette from the air. Their conning towers barely disturbed the sea's surface. Detecting them required patience and a new understanding of signal behavior. Crews learned to track the subtle flicker of a periscope exposed for seconds at a time, or the distorted echo of a snorkel. Radar sets originally designed for surface ships were adapted for aircraft, granting the escort carriers a reach that extended far beyond what any lookout could see. Anti-submarine weapons evolved in parallel. Sonobuoys, dropped from aircraft in seemingly random patterns, formed underwater listening nets that could trace a submarine by sound alone. Depth charges, once crude and imprecise, were refined with variable fuse settings suited for aerial attack. Pilots practiced new tactics, high-speed runs across a suspected wake, timed drops calibrated to detonate at the depth a U-boat would likely reach during a crash dive. Each improvement tightened the noose, reducing the margin of error that had allowed submarines to slip away in the early war years. communication systems fused these innovations into a coherent whole. Escort carriers began integrating HFDF, high-frequency direction finding, into their operations. These radio stations, operated by specialists who interpreted German transmissions, could triangulate the rough position of a U-boat when it surfaced to report a contact or to coordinate an attack. The moment a signal was intercepted, aircraft could be launched and vector toward a grid square miles before the submarine even realized it had been detected. The sea, once a place of hidden movement, was becoming increasingly transparent. Pilots, too, adapted their instincts to the rhythms of the enemy. Through experience and intelligence briefings, they learned to anticipate the fragile moments that defined submarine life. Dawn and dusk, when U-boats often surfaced to charge batteries. Calm weather, when they risked quick transmissions to coordinate attacks. The early hours after a convoy sighting, when captains edged closer to report the convoy's speed and composition. These windows of vulnerability became the focal points for escort carrier patrols. Rather than simply reacting to threats, pilots began predicting them, circling high, waiting for the moment a dark shape breached the surface. What emerged from this web of improvements was something few had foreseen. An escort carrier, derided as impractical, mocked as a floating coffin, dismissed by admirals who believed only in the power of big ships, became the centerpiece of a new defensive orchestra. Aircraft, sonar, radar, intelligence intercepts, and destroyer screens worked in concert, each reinforcing the other. The carriers did not fight with overwhelming force, they fought with coordination. And coordination, in mid-Atlantic darkness, was becoming more powerful than any battleship broadside. Yet for all their progress, a sober truth remained. The Battle of the Atlantic was far from decided. The spring of 1943 loomed on every operations chart, a period when Wolfpack activity historically surged, when convoys stretched thin, and when the weather provided just enough cover for submarines to operate aggressively. The escort carriers had proven their concept. They had demonstrated influence, discipline, and evolving strength. But influence was not victory. The decisive test had yet to arrive, the moment when these unlikely ships would be forced to stand between a convoy and the full weight of Dönitz's Wolfpacks, with nothing but their small decks and determined crews to hold the line. And as winter gave way to spring, both sides prepared for an encounter that would mark the turning point of the Atlantic War. May 1943 arrived without ceremony, but in the convoy lanes its meaning was unmistakable. For the first time in the war, the mid-Atlantic, the vast stretch of water that had long favored the submarine, was no longer empty. Escort carriers, once scarce and experimental, now sailed with convoy after convoy. Their decks launched aircraft from dawn until dusk, sweeping the ocean with a persistence the U-boats had never faced. Where submarines had once surfaced freely to charge batteries or coordinate attacks, they now found the sky restless, watched, and increasingly hostile. Dönitz answered this growing pressure with the boldest gamble of his career. He assembled 40 submarines into new Wolfpacks, deploying them in carefully arranged patrol lines across the convoy routes. It was an effort to restore initiative through scale, to overwhelm the escorts, saturate their defenses, and break the momentum the Allies were beginning to build. German crews understood the stakes. This surge was intended as a decisive counterstroke, the moment when the Atlantic would again tilt toward the Reich. Yet they sailed into waters that no longer favored them. Low visibility, once the submariner's ally, now became a trap. Thick fog and low clouds helped conceal the movement of convoys, but they also covered the approach of aircraft. Patrol planes launched from escort carriers flew beneath the overcast, engines muffled by the weather, their presence hidden until the final moment. More than one U-boat, traveling on the surface to conserve battery power, looked up to find a dark aircraft plunging toward it from the gloom with almost no warning. By the time the alarm sounded, depth charges were already in the water. Night offered no safety. The Allies had introduced Lee lights, powerful searchlights mounted beneath patrol aircraft, designed specifically to illuminate submarines attempting to operate under cover of darkness. For U-boat crews, the first sight of those blinding beams slicing through the blackness felt unnatural, almost theatrical, followed instantly by the harsh reality of an imminent attack. Boats that had surfaced to take in fresh air or recharge batteries were thrown into panic as the ocean around them exploded into columns of water. The night, once their refuge, had become a stage on which they were suddenly exposed. Carrier pilots responded with precision, born of months of relentless practice. When radar operators on the escort carriers detected a faint surface contact, aircraft were vectored immediately to the coordinates. The pilots learned to strike in rapid succession. One pass forced a dive. A second chased the submarine beneath the thermocline. A third dropped depth charges calibrated to the depth at which a diving U-boat was most vulnerable. Within minutes, a single carrier could sweep an entire sector, driving multiple submarines underwater before they had time to coordinate with their packmates. Dönitz's planned assaults melted into confusion. Below the air battle, the escort groups wove their own layers of defense. Destroyers and corvettes used improved radar to track U-boats at greater distances, their sonar nets overlapping beneath the waves. HFDF stations aboard the escorts intercepted German transmissions, pinpointing submarines attempting to gather for coordinated strikes. Depth charges, launched in patterns now refined through months of data, hemmed in the submarines even as they tried to escape. Aircraft overhead relayed sightings to ships below, and ships responded in kind, forming a synchronized rhythm of detection and pursuit. It was coordination on a level the U-boats had never encountered. Faced with this tightening sphere of Allied capability, the wolf packs discovered the ocean was no longer their home ground. Boats that had once stalked convoys with confidence now struggled simply to survive long enough to fire a torpedo. Every hour submerged drained their batteries. Every attempt to surface risked a sudden attack. The very conditions that had made the U-boat fleet so effective, stealth, patience, and shared intelligence, were being dismantled by an enemy that had finally mastered the tools of the deep. By mid-May, the shift was undeniable. The hunters were being hunted. Dönitz's most ambitious effort had collided with a new reality. The escort carrier had transformed the Atlantic into contested territory. And as the month unfolded, the question was no longer whether the U-boats could regain the initiative, but whether they could survive the storm that was only beginning. The unraveling began quietly, almost without notice. On the cold grey waters around convoy HX-237, its escort sailed in disciplined formation, their guns manned, their radar scanning the horizon in slow mechanical arcs. Above them circled the real guardians of the convoy, the Avengers launched from the escort carrier assigned to its protection. These aircraft, heavy with depth charges and radar pods, probed the sea in widening spirals. When the first radar contact flickered across a pilot screen, a faint surface echo that betrayed a U-boat edging into firing position, the aircraft banked sharply, descending through the cloud layer with a practiced, deliberate calm. Moments later, a string of depth charges erupted along the submarine's path, turning the grey water white. The U-boat, caught before it could dive deep enough, broke apart beneath the surface. It was not an isolated moment. As the convoy pushed eastward, more U-boats attempted to close in, confident in the Wolfpack tactics that had served them for years. But each attempt met the same fate. Aircraft arrived first, far earlier than the captains expected, forcing sudden dives that disrupted torpedo preparations. The few submarines bold enough to stay surfaced for a few seconds longer were met by direct attacks, their plans shattered by explosions that left little room for deception. What had once been a coordinated assault dissolved into scattered attempts at survival. By the end of the engagement, HX-237 had lost ships, but nowhere near the number the Germans anticipated. The real losses belonged to the attackers. Elsewhere across the Atlantic, another wolf pack, one of Dönitz's largest formations, found itself under relentless aerial pressure. Aircraft from multiple escort carriers patrolled in overlapping grids, turning the ocean into a shifting mosaic of observation. Daylight forced the U-boats downward. Night, once their sanctuary, proved equally dangerous under the glare of lee lights. A boat that surfaced to recharge batteries might be illuminated before its watch officer could shout a warning. Others, trying to avoid attention, lingered submerged until their batteries dropped to critical levels. The wolf pack that had set out with ambition found itself slowly scattered, its captains fighting exhaustion rather than convoys. Inside BDU headquarters, radio intercepts painted a darker picture. Messages from the front became terse, restrained, and increasingly reluctant. German captains who once maneuvered aggressively now hesitated to follow attack orders. Some refused outright, citing fuel, battery strain, or aircraft sightings. Others reported that their boats could not maintain formation under constant surveillance. In the language of U-boat communications, normally clipped and confident, there emerged a tone of resignation. They were still at sea, but the sea no longer belonged to them. As reports accumulated, Dönitz faced a reality he had long feared. Boats were returning damaged, unable to dive safely, or running on dangerously depleted batteries. Others failed to return at all. His staff logged each loss with clinical precision, but the human cost seeped through the numbers. Each submarine represented 40 to 50 men. Each sinking meant an entire crew, trained, experienced, and irreplaceable, lost to the deep. In May 1943, alone, the U-boat arm suffered the destruction of 41 submarines. It was a figure without precedent, a hemorrhage of capability no force could sustain. And so, with a few lines of radio code, an era ended. Ahead lay the question that would define the next phase of the campaign. If the U-boats could no longer dominate the Atlantic, what role could they possibly play in the war that remained? By the closing months of 1943, the numbers told a story more devastating than any communiqué. In January, the U-boat force operating in the Atlantic had stood at 108 boats, enough to saturate convoy routes, overwhelm escorts, and stretch Allied resources to the breaking point. But by autumn, that same fleet had been reduced to 31 operational submarines capable of deployment. Losses, damage, and exhaustion had hollowed out what had once been the most feared arm of the German Navy. The reduction was not simply numerical, it was symbolic. A force that had shaped the early war now struggled to preserve even the illusion of relevance. As the U-boats dwindled, the escort carriers expanded, quietly, steadily, and with growing confidence. Each new hull that entered service arrived with refinements drawn from thousands of hours of hard-won experience. Flight decks were reinforced to reduce flex, radar sets increased in range and clarity, air groups adopted standardized patrol grids, ensuring no sector of the convoy's perimeter went unobserved. What began as a handful of experimental conversions had become a maturing fleet, its capabilities sharpened by every crossing of the Atlantic. Every carrier launched contained lessons distilled from the ships before it. Convoys now sailed under conditions unrecognizable from those of early 1943. aircraft rose from their decks at dawn, patrolled throughout the day, and guided destroyers toward contacts long before danger materialized. At night, Lee lights pierced the darkness, turning the ocean surface into a place where no U-boat could safely linger. Radio men aboard the carriers tracked German transmissions in real time, plotting course adjustments before the enemy could form attack groups. What had once required luck and improvisation had settled into a dependable rhythm, a routine form of protection that a year earlier had seemed aspirational at best. With the sea lanes secured, Allied industrial output flowed outward without constraint. American shipyards delivered Liberty ships in record numbers. Tankers crossed from the Gulf of Mexico to Britain, laden with fuel essential for the air war over Europe. Troop transports carried divisions toward the Mediterranean, enabling campaigns in Sicily, Italy, and beyond. Supplies that once traveled with a sense of peril now moved with the certainty of arrival. For the first time since 1939, the strategic planners of London and Washington could assume that what they sent across the ocean would reach its destination intact. Historians later traced this transformation not to a single victory or a sudden technological leap, but to the slow, cumulative influence of the escort carriers. They became the quiet architects of logistical supremacy. Larger carriers captured the imagination, but it was the small decks, the so-called baby flattops, that ensured the Allied war machine could function on a global scale. Academics studying the period often describe them as the hinge upon which the Atlantic War turned, a modest platform that altered the trajectory of an entire theater. In naval circles, perceptions shifted just as dramatically. The ships once mocked as impractical became essential assets, their utility no longer questioned. Fleet carriers projected power. Escort carriers preserved it. They escorted not only convoys, but the very possibility of sustained operations overseas. By eliminating the mid-Atlantic gap, they allowed the Allies to plan offensives months in advance, without the constant fear that a surge of U-boats might sever the arteries connecting continents. What had started as a reluctant experiment matured into doctrine. For the sailors and air crews who manned these ships, the change was felt in subtler ways. They no longer launched into skies thick with uncertainty. Instead, their patrols became part of a larger mosaic of defense that stretched across thousands of miles. Their presence reassured convoy captains who had once scanned the horizon with dread. Each mission strengthened the bond between the carrier crews and the merchant sailors they protected, a relationship built not on words, but on the simple fact of survival. By late 1943, the Atlantic itself seemed altered. The same waters that had swallowed thousands of tons of cargo and countless lives were beginning to feel different, less like contested territory and more like a corridor of inevitability. Ships moved with purpose, not fear. The ocean no longer belonged to the unseen enemy below, but to the coordinated machinery above it. The shift was not emotional, it was structural. A battlefield defined by uncertainty had become a thoroughfare defined by control. The escort carriers, small though they were, had redrawn the geometry of the war. They had closed the gap, denied the wolf packs their sanctuary, and ensured that the tide of supplies and soldiers could flow unbroken from shore to shore. The U-boat arm, reduced to a fraction of its former strength, could do little but watch as the balance of power slipped irreversibly away. And yet, as the Allies prepared for the next phase of the conflict, a final question lingered unresolved. How would the carriers shape the battles that lay beyond the horizon? In the grand theater of wartime storytelling, the escort carrier seldom claimed center stage. It appeared rarely on posters, almost never in recruiting films, and only faintly in newsreels, where sleek fleet carriers dominated the camera's gaze. The public imagination favored speed, symmetry, and drama, qualities these small ships did not possess. Their silhouettes were awkward, their decks short, their engines underpowered. To a hurried glance, they looked more like merchants wearing borrowed uniforms than like instruments of strategy. Yet beneath their plain steel, they carried a quiet brilliance that reshaped the war at sea. Their crews understood the contradiction better than anyone. Life aboard an escort carrier was a study in monotony. Long days of steady patrols, the hum of engines that never fully relented, and the endless grey horizon, broken only by weather and the faint outlines of merchant ships. The carriers lacked the glamour of Pacific Fleet operations. There were no dramatic strikes against enemy bases, no sweeping offensives announced with fanfare. Instead, the rhythm was slow and repetitive. Launch, patrol, recover, refuel, standby. Yet the men understood that within this routine lived moments of enormous consequence. A single radar contact, a single periscope sighted by chance, could shift the fate of an entire convoy. Those decisive minutes, when they arrived, came without warning. A pilot scanning empty water might suddenly bank sharply toward a thin, unnatural line on the surface. A sonar operator aboard a destroyer might receive a crackling message from an Avenger overhead. Possible contact, bearing, closing. In such moments, the escort carrier shed its humble image and revealed its purpose. Each aircraft it launched became an extension of the convoy's will, pushing outward, hunting rather than merely guarding. The defensive war that had defined the early Atlantic, reactive, uncertain, fearful, gave way to something far more assertive. For the first time, the Allies chased the submarine threat instead of waiting for it. This shift marked a profound evolution in naval thinking. Before the escort carriers, naval aviation had centered on fleet battles, large ships engaging at long range, their aircraft serving as striking arms of concentrated power. But the Battle of the Atlantic demonstrated a different application of air power, not the pursuit of decisive engagements, but the steady enforcement of control. Sea control, once an abstract term, found concrete expression in these small decks. They allowed naval aviation to stretch across oceans in thin but persistent layers, reaching places no cruiser or battleship could influence. They proved that dominance came not only from force, but from presence. Within the U.S. Navy, the lesson did not go unnoticed. The emergence of the escort carrier forced a re-evaluation of doctrines that had long prioritized speed and firepower. Officers accustomed to thinking in terms of fleet concentrations began to consider the value of distributed capability. Power projection, it turned out, did not always require a fast carrier and a large air group. Sometimes it required only a handful of aircraft, operating from a modest platform, positioned where no adversary expected them. Escort carriers had expanded the vocabulary of naval warfare. They showed that aviation could shape logistics, protect commerce, and dictate the tempo of operations across vast distances. This rethinking echoed far beyond the Atlantic. The Pacific, with its sprawling island chains and long supply routes, soon became another stage for the escort carriers. They supported amphibious landings, ferried aircraft to advanced bases, and guarded supply lines stretching from California to the Philippines. Their slow speed was no longer a flaw, but a feature, the natural pace of a war fought across thousands of miles of open water. Pilots accustomed to hunting U-boats now learned to provide close air support to Marines, revealing yet another dimension of what these ships could do. In retrospect, historians argue that the escort carrier's greatest achievement was not a single victory, but a strategic reorientation. It proved that sea power was not confined to decisive battles. It demonstrated that the ability to safeguard movement of ships, supplies, and information could determine the outcome of an entire campaign. The humble decks of these carriers became the quiet engines of Allied momentum. Their influence endured long after the war, informing doctrines of convoy protection, anti-submarine warfare, and distributed maritime operations that persist into the present day. Though they seldom appeared in headlines, their legacy remains unmistakable. They turned the Atlantic from a battleground of fear into a corridor of certainty. They allowed nations separated by oceans to act as though they were neighbors, and they gave naval aviation a new purpose, one defined not by spectacle, but by steady, relentless protection. Yet even as their importance grew, one final question lingered. How would history remember the ships that won a war without ever asking for recognition? In the years after the guns fell silent, historians began the slow, meticulous work of measuring what had truly shaped the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. They sifted through convoy reports, decoded messages, patrol logs, and lost tables, thousands of pages documenting a struggle fought across an ocean. The conclusion that emerged surprised even those who had lived through the war. No single weapon, no single platform had reduced U-boat effectiveness as quickly or as decisively as the escort carrier. Larger ships had drawn more attention, and longer-ranged aircraft had claimed more headlines, but it was the small, steady presence of the escort carriers that strangled the wolf pack's ability to operate. They did not merely tip the balance, they accelerated the collapse. Post-war analysts understood why. Innovation is rarely born from ideal conditions. It emerges instead from the narrow spaces where necessity meets limitation. The escort carriers were a response to a crisis, a solution crafted not from doctrinal purity, but from improvisation and urgency. They embodied the willingness to rethink assumptions, that aviation need not come from large decks, that power could be projected at low speed, that protection could be distributed rather than concentrated. Their success was a testament to creativity that flourishes when tradition loosens its grip. For the men who served aboard them, the irony remained sharp. Many had been assigned reluctantly, if not grudgingly, to the baby Flattops. They had stepped onto their decks, believing they were entering a footnote of naval warfare, a temporary measure until real ships took over. Yet those same men watched the tide turn around them. They saw convoys cross safely, wolf packs scattered, and loss reports diminish. In retrospect, they remembered the silence between sorties, the gentle pitch of the deck, the smell of aviation fuel in narrow hangars, the feel of cold wind during dawn launches, and realized they had been part of something far larger than the steel beneath their feet. They had served on ships that changed the shape of the war. Modern navies absorbed the lesson deeply. The idea that small, modular aviation platforms could influence vast areas of ocean found expression in post-war doctrine. Helicopter carriers, amphibious assault ships, fast-deploying aviation barges, and later modular flight decks all owed something to the humble escort carrier. The principle was simple but profound. Aviation does not need grandeur to be decisive. It needs only to be present, persistent, and properly integrated. The escort carriers had shown that even modest aircraft operating from unassuming ships could shift the balance of a theater. That idea shaped naval strategy from the Cold War through the modern age. The truest measure of their influence, however, lay not in design, but in logistics, the quiet arithmetic that determines the fate of nations. Allied victory depended not merely on battles won, but on the movement of food, oil, equipment, and people across oceans. Without secure Atlantic routes, the invasions of North Africa, Italy, and France would have been impossible. Factories building tanks in Detroit, aircraft in Seattle, and munitions in Montreal would have produced goods with no path to the front. Britain would have faced shortages with consequences deeper than strategy could contain. In the vast network of supply that stretched across continents, a disruption of only a few percentage points could have altered the war's tempo, perhaps even its outcome. Escort carriers ensured that disruption never came. Their presence transformed the Atlantic from a deadly corridor into a reliable artery. Every ship that arrived safely carried within it the accumulated labor of thousands of workers, the confidence of planners, the sustenance of armies, and the hope of populations who depended on lines of supply they could not see. The escort carriers did not win headlines. They ensured the conditions in which victory became possible. For this reason, their legacy is not measured in dramatic footage or celebrated duels, but in the quiet endurance of nations kept alive by ships that escorted the lifeline of a global war. Their strength lay not in spectacle, but in steadfastness. They expanded the boundaries of what naval aviation could be, proving that the simplest ideas, applied consistently and with conviction, could redraw the geometry of strategy. And so, the final irony endures. The ships once dismissed as impractical, makeshift, and temporary became among the most indispensable instruments of Allied victory. They safeguarded continents, sustained coalitions, and reshaped doctrine long after the war's end. They called them impractical once. They never did again.